After all that commotion had ended, everyone went to their respective dorms, and the next day in the academy, Vivian asked Diane about the flower Andreas had made, to which Diane asked her if she meant that flower. In response, Vivian told Dean yes and pointed out that Andreas told her that he had given it to her. So Vivian asked Diane if she could give it to her. Diane, puzzled by the sudden statement, responded by asking Vivian if she wasn't a student of the night faculty, further questioning her what she needed it for, as besides she wanted to study that, so giving it to her is a bit much. Listening to Diane, the expression on Vivian's face instantly changed. At the same time, Dean just looked at Vivian in surprise. Then, with the most saddened expression, Vivian asked Diane if she couldn't, to which Dean, immediately sensing her sadness, said all right, she would give it to her. Diane then instantly gave the magic circle to Vivian and told her that she could just draw a new one anyway, and began to explain that to see the flower she needed to use mana like that, and told her after that she needed to do this, while Lucia, who was passing by, noticed them talking and kept looking at them in curiosity. Immediately, Vivian looked astonished as the flower from the magic circle blossomed by Diane, who channeled her mana into it, and all Vivian could do was exclaim wow as she saw the flower. Suddenly, a voice distracted them, which exclaimed "oh," and asked them if that was the rumored flower. At the same time, Diane and Vivian glanced towards the direction of the voice. It was none other than Lucia, who leaned towards the flower and asked them if that was the contradiction made by the senior seaweed head. Diane then, waving her hand, said "oh, Lucia," and asked her if she was heading somewhere, to which Lucia, yawning, said that classes were over, so she thought she would go to the lab. Lucia then, looking closely at the flower, pointed out that it seemed like it was missing something, to which Diane questioned her, huh? Lucia then, pointing at the magic circle, told them that over there, and asked them wasn't that part a bit out of shape, to which Diane also agreed with her, saying "oh there," and that she thought so too. Lucia then, enthusiastically taking her pen out from her bag, claimed that she smelled something deliberately being hidden. So Lucia began mending it as she explained if they smooth out that part, to which Vivian, who was holding the magic circle, made a panicked expression as she tried to stop Lucia, while Diane paid close attention to what Lucia was doing. Then Lucia told Vivian to please stay still for a second. Simultaneously, as Lucia mended the magic circle, she held a flower with her hands and told them that now they needed to add a flow spell. Instantly, as she added the flow spell, a mysterious light started to surround them, while the grass they were standing on transformed into flowers that blossomed everywhere. Meanwhile, all they could do was question in amazement as to what that was. Diane then, looking at her surroundings, told everyone that she didn't really believe it at first, but she knew it was a double magic circle. Meanwhile, Lucia still was puzzled as she could not comprehend how the senior seaweed head made that. Abruptly, their attention was diverted as they witnessed a professor who was bending down on one knee to observe the magic circle. He then exclaimed that it was the rumored magic circle, to which Lucia could not understand what the professor was doing and just said, "huh." The professor was none other than the dean of the magic faculty, Beilco Costello, who, holding the flower, claimed that it was a splendid innovation as it expressed contradiction to that extent with just basic spells. Diane immediately then bowed to the professor and asked him to pardon them for activating a magic circle in a place like that, to which Professor Beilco asked them about the student who made that and also what was his name. At the same time, Vivian was still amazed as the magic circle Andreas made and was staring at it intensely. Diane then, with a worried look, told him that it was a fourth-year student, Andreas Cromwell. Beilco, the professor, then looking at the flower, began to wonder about Andreas Cromwell, as he was the one everyone had been talking about lately. Furthermore, he thought of a magic circle made for one task, that was on the verge of creating a stepping stone to immortality, the ultimate contradiction. As the professor stood there in complete silence wondering about Andreas, Diane was confused as he had not said anything for a while. Then Diane, with a puzzled expression, hesitantly asked Beilco if there was something. But to their surprise, Beilco, the professor, turned around and began to leave without telling them anything, while all three of them just stood there in confusion. Lucia then, with an annoyed look, asked what was with him as he just asked what he wanted, and then just ignored them like that, while Diane, who was panicking at her statement, told her to shush as she couldn't say that. Meanwhile, Beilco, who was walking away from them, started to wonder how fascinating it was, as he never thought the day would come when a student's work would inspire him. So, thinking about Andreas Cromwell, he decided that he would keep an eye on him. After a while in the training ground, many students were sparring relentlessly, while some were discussing on the sidelines. Luis, then wiping his sweat off his face, thanked Vivian for sparring with him. Furthermore, calling her senior, he pointed out that she was really strong. Then Vivian, who was drinking water from her bottle, told him that he was quite strong too, to which Luis just gave a small laugh. Luis then began to wonder how his conversations with senior Vivian didn't really last long. Abruptly, his chain of thoughts were interrupted by a yelling voice that said you're second best in your year, and that was all you got. So Luis, along with everyone else, looked towards the direction of the sound. It was coming from the sparring grounds where one senior was furiously swinging his sword towards his junior Chris while yelling at him for being incompetent. Chris then deflected the attack with a single swing and told his senior to shut up. But to his surprise, the senior rushed at him and kicked in his chest, which sent him flying a few steps back. Chris, then trying to stand with his sword, started to wonder how, with his current flawed swordsmanship, it would be difficult to beat him. Suddenly, Chris began to reminisce about Andreas and how he told him to keep following his path without any doubts. So with a determined look, Chris thought, as Senior Andreas said, he shouldn't doubt his own sword. Then, maintaining his fighting stance, Chris prepared to launch his attack because the essence of the Uner style was already engraved in his body. Instantly, the senior came rushing at Chris, stating that no matter what he did, it would all be the same. But that was not enough for Chris to be defeated, as he instantly blocked his attack with his own sword. The clash between them was so powerful that sparks could be seen as they both held their swords tightly. Meanwhile, Chris thought how the Uner style was a sword that confuses its opponents with its ever-changing sword strokes. Instantly, Chris vanished from where he was standing, which even surprised the senior, who could not believe that Chris had just vanished. Suddenly, Chris sneaked behind the senior as he thought how he needed to parry the opponent's sword and break his posture. The senior had also realized where Chris was and instantly turned around as he yelled "bastard" and questioned him for moving around like a worm, while Chris thought how finally he should aim for the decisive blow. Suddenly, Chris reappeared below the senior, holding his sword close to his neck, which left the furious senior startled and confused as he could not comprehend Chris's moves. Chris, with a determined look, immediately told the senior that it seemed like he had won. In response, the senior just slapped Chris's sword from his other hand and yelled "damn this," while Chris just looked at him with a confused look. Then the senior immediately threw his sword on the sparring battleground and began to exclaim in frustration, stating that he had lost to such trash. He then claimed what a joke it was and instantly told everyone that he was done with that shit. But Chris, being the good guy, he was told to his senior no, and that I was not a joke. Furthermore, Chris began to explain how the senior's swordsmanship was great enough, to which the senior just made an annoyed face. But Chris did not stop there, and with a concerned look on his face, he began calling for the senior to respond. The senior then, with a disgusting look, glanced at Chris in annoyance and told us not to run his mouth. The senior then, without any hesitation, picked up the real sword which was in front of him and threw it near Chris. It took a few moments for Chris to realize what the senior was implying, but as he kept staring at the sword, he noticed that it was a real sword which was used for battle, not for sparring. Immediately, with a furious look, Chris questioned his senior what he meant by that. Furthermore, he asked him if that wasn't a real sword, to which the senior just casually opened a potion bottle and told Chris to shut up and take it, as he would make him regret for making fun of him. Instantly, Luis, who was witnessing all of this with Vivian by his side, called out for Chris and told him to apologize and get it over with, while Chris was trying to figure out what that potion was. Simultaneously, after hearing all this commotion, one of the supervisors came out calling the senior and asked him what he was doing, while the senior, paying no attention to his surroundings, began to drink the potion immediately. Instantly, the senior's eyes turned blood red and veins started popping out from his face like they were going to explode, while all Chris could do was watch the senior for a distance in complete confusion and surprise. The supervisor walked towards the senior, calling him Todd, and asked him why would a student like him be here on that exchange, but his attention was instantly diverted as he saw the real swords, which made him ask if that was a real sword. The supervisor then immediately told Todd to put it back right now, but as he was saying this, a sudden slash was sent towards him. Witnessing this made Chris shocked as he tried to comprehend what had just happened right in front of him. Not only Chris, but Luis and Vivian, along with everyone present there, were left stunned at what they just witnessed. It was none other than Todd, who had slashed the supervisor in his chest, making him instantly fall back and scream in pain as someone from the crowd called Todd a murderer. Then Todd, holding his sword, which had blood of the supervisor dripping from it, told the first-year brats to come on and face him. Todd, then, with a face full of rage from his previous defeat, wanted to face off against Chris once again. So Todd told Chris it was time for the second round. At the same time, somewhere inside the academy, someone called Andreas, Mr. Andreas, and kept calling him. Instantly, Andreas heard his name being addressed as Mr. Andreas. So he turned around to the direction of the voice to see who it was. It was none other than his junior, who was sitting beside him in the class earlier. So Andreas told him to just call him Andreas, to which his junior responded by stating that he was 2 years younger than him, and then calling him Mr. Andreas, he told him that he should talk to him casually. Andreas then, with a cunning smile, asked him if he was sure, to which the junior just simply told Andreas of course. Then the junior immediately told Andreas, by the way, about that magic circle the other day, and claimed that it was actually a double magic circle, asking him if it wasn't. Furthermore, he asked Andreas how he came up with that. Andreas then, with a calm look, questioned him if it wasn't more fun if there was a hidden element, to which the junior just looked at him in confusion and asked if that was his reason. Andreas then began reminiscing about the text he received from Lucia, in which she pointed out that it was a double magic circle and asked him if he learned to do that, to which Andreas just asked her if she found it already, further claiming that it was amazing. Then Lucia replied, stating that she discovered it when she was looking at it with Senior Vivienne and Senior Diane. Finally, Lucia pointed out that if he had time to do things like that and requested him to please help her with her research as she hadn't made any progress lately. This made Andreas question himself why Vivienne was together with them. Then Andreas began wondering how he seriously tried to hide it, but in the hands of those two playables, they found it in just a day. The junior then, calling Andreas Mr., told him that it reminds me as he had heard that Everlast potion was also created by him. So he asked Andreas if he was going to show us in the potion class today. Andreas then, with a cunning smile, glanced at his junior and told him that he was planning to stay low-key as he couldn't show his tools of the trade to the class now, can we? At the same time, in the back of his mind, Andreas thought how he didn't want to stand out in front of Kyler. Suddenly, their attention was diverted as a huge explosion happened just a few steps ahead of them, while all they could do was shield themselves from the impact. Andreas, along with his junior, was left in a state of shock as they tried to comprehend what could have happened. As the smoke and dust cleared from where the explosion had occurred, all that could be seen was Diane, who had used her magic barrier to defend against the explosion. Andreas then, with a look of concern, immediately called out to Diane to understand the situation they were in. Diane then instantly told Andreas that was a monster, while a huge hand could be seen from where the explosion was launched, which slowly approached Ian, calling her in a trembling voice. It was none other than Maillon, who had consumed multiple potions that were given to him and had transformed into a creature with extraordinary power. Maillon then walked closer to Diane and asked her how dare she make a fool of him. Witnessing the creature Maillon had become, Andreas looked at him in utter shock, while his junior, who had sweat dripping from his face, questioned if it was actually Maillon. Andreas then, looking at Maillon, called him a dimwit. As Maillon grinned and stood face to face with Diane, who had a worried look on her face, while Andreas and Ketchlong were watching towards them with a confused state, while Andreas, looking at Maillon, thought a body that grows larger and larger, and looked toward his eyes, which was turning pitch black with a hint of purple, and thought to himself how his eyes sclerae were turning black as veins popped from his face. Abruptly, Maillon, with pitch black eyes and veins popping, laughed as he told how he would teach Diane what happened when someone screwed with him, while Andreas, after observing everything, concluded that it was definitely a side effect of Kyler's potion. With anger in her eyes, she yelled if he was out of his mind, further asking if he thought he could get away with doing this at another academy. With a worried look on his face, he thought to himself how an incident that was supposed to happen during the midterm exams would happen now, and thought how that was the downside of relying too much on information from the game, and concluded that he should have been keeping an eye on him from the start of the school year, and cursed Kyler addressing that piece of shit. Kyler, with his things packed, was making his way towards the escape while sudden explosions started to occur around the academy, and he suddenly stopped for a moment and glanced back at the academy, exclaiming how it had begun, his farewell party. Meanwhile, Maillon, with rage in his eyes, held his hand upward with flames in his hand, which grew bigger and bigger as he yelled how he would blast that big mouth of Diane, who was standing still nervously as Maillon's power overwhelmed her. Abruptly yelling, "Eat this," he threw the flame towards Diane, who stood still worried as she could not move a muscle. To her surprise, Andreas dashed in front of her and swiftly swung his sword, successfully stopping and taking down the flame thrown by Maillon instantly with ease. Maillon was left in a state of shock as he could not comprehend how his massive flame attack was stopped so suddenly and easily, not harming Diane, his real target. While small leftover flames were raining everywhere, Andreas addressed Maillon as dimwit, to which Dean asked, addressing him as Andreas, who turned sideways glancing towards Maillon and asked if he remembered how there was no taking that back since he had initiated the fight, while Diane was nervously glancing at Andreas speak so confidently. With veins popping and saliva drooling from his mouth, he exclaimed how Andreas was a smug bastard from yesterday, which made Andreas realize that he still had a bit of reason left, which meant it hadn't been that long since he drank the potion. With excitement in his voice, he clenched both his fists, telling it was perfect that he got the chance to kill both of them. Andreas and Diane were keenly looking towards Maillon, while Ketchlung hurriedly rushed towards Andreas, addressing him as Mr. Andreas and asking if he was all right. Andreas glanced towards Ketchlung, claiming he was fine, and further ordered both of them to stand back for now. Meanwhile, with her mouth wide open, Diane, with a look of surprise, exclaimed how that guy killed a Beilco student, while Ketchlung kept staring with nervousness in his eyes. Glancing back, Andreas told how they would leave the cleanup to the professors. He told Diane that he would buy her some time further, suggesting her to prepare some powerful magic, something that could blow him away in one hit. Meanwhile, Maillon started to scream and tear his clothes apart as his anger started to fuel up, and he started to lose more of his sense. With her eyes wide open, she stumbled and was caught in a state of shock as she agreed to Andreas and asked herself how Andreas could be so calm in such a dire situation. Looking at Maillon, who was growling, Diane told how his body was extremely tough, to which Andreas, staring at Maillon with his sword aimed at him, told it was not a problem at all, because with Ketchlung's support, she should have enough firepower, which made Ketchlung stumble as he looked towards Andreas, questioning with a "huh." With a nervous look on his face, he exclaimed, "Understood," while Diane, who was running far from Maillon, looked back at him, addressing him as Ketchlung and telling him to come with her. Andreas stood still, maintaining his fighting stance, while Diane and Ketchlung rushed towards the other corner, which made Maillon startle, as he couldn't comprehend what they were doing, and immediately leaned back, his hand with flames all over, his veins started popping all over his body, and with his mouth full of saliva he yelled where they were going and aimed his flame attack at them, but Andreas quickly dashed in front of him, planning to stop his attack. Abruptly yelling "Die!", Maillon launched his flame attack towards them. The flame was so huge that it looked like a dragon breathed it. But on the other side was Andreas, who with his sword was blocking off Maillon's flame attack and told him that he was too loud, addressing him as a pig, which fueled up Maillon's anger even more as more and more veins started to pop. With a serious look on his face, he pulled back his sword and told if he couldn't even speak properly, and immediately swung his sword, launching a counterattack with his sword, telling Maillon to shut his mouth, while Maillon was caught in a state of shock as he was not anticipating a counterattack so soon. Suddenly, a large clang sound came after Andreas launched the attack. But, to his surprise, Maillon, with his eyes glowing bright, had activated a shield before him that he used to stop Andreas's counterattack so easily. Meanwhile, Ketchlung was supporting Diane by drawing a magic circle around her, while Diane was getting ready to cast her spell. Andreas, with a displeased look on his face, looked at Maillon and cursed, saying, "Damn it," thinking to himself, even though he was spoiled, he was still a mage, and wondered how it was thanks to the potion his shield had become much stronger as well. Seeing how his shield easily blocked off Andreas's counterattack, Maillon started laughing loudly with a devilish look on his face. Abruptly, with his eyes glowing bright, he leaned back his sword and infused it with mana as it started to emit fiery mana from around it in an instant. Thinking how it didn't matter, and with a determination to break through it, Andreas dashed forward, launching yet another blow, planning to pierce the shield Maillon had cast around him. Meanwhile, Diane, who was casting her own spell, looked towards Andreas as he launched yet another counterattack, and was left in a state of shock as she thought to herself how Andreas was wrapping his sword in magic even faster than at the tournament, while Ketchlung was very much focused brewing his own magic circle to help Diane. The shield he cast had started to change its color as he clenched his teeth. His eyes also started glowing purple bright, while the attack Andreas launched was not piercing his shield at all, which confused Andreas as the shield couldn't be pierced even though he infused his sword with mana. Clenching his hand with pitch-long, pitch-black nails, he made his shield even stronger as Andreas had launched a mana-infused sword. Both their auras were so strong that a gush of wind was blowing in their opposite direction as Maillon strengthened his shield and Andreas continued using more of his force to pierce through the shield. Meanwhile, Ketchlung was supporting Diane with his own magic circle, while Diane had started to draw up her own magic circle, planning to hit it to Maillon. With a nervous look on his face, sweat dripped from his face as the attack he had launched was not affecting Maillon at all. Abruptly, with a troubled look on his face, he yelled Mr. Andreas, telling him to watch out. With a monstrous look on his face, he laughed as he leaped his hand forward towards Andreas, launching another counterattack with beam of lights which resembled the shape and sharpness of a sword. Raising his hand up, Andreas, with a displeased look on his face, cast a spell Earth Shield to defend himself from Maillon's beam of light attack. Instantly, Maillon launched his attacks towards Andreas, which he defended using his Earth Shield, as a huge boulder was summoned, but Maillon's attacks were so fierce that the beam of lights pierced through the huge boulder summoned by Andreas. He blocked the attack on time. With a displeased look on his face, he gazed at the attacks launched by Maillon, but thankfully, his quick reflex helped him defend the attack, saving himself from it. Throwing the boulder pierced with Maillon's magic away from him. He had a displeased look on his face as he asked himself if he was really losing his mind, and if he just used offensive magic while keeping his barrier up. Suddenly, Maillon's body started to change as muscles from several parts of his body started to bounce out. Meanwhile, Andreas was in front of him, and as he witnessed Maillon's body changing, he thought to himself how it was not good and they had got to stop him before he reached the final stage and instantly leaped forward towards Maillon with the intent of stopping him before he wreaked any more havoc after turning into his final stage. Abruptly, Andreas reached on top of Maillon and hit him with a hard headbutt. Both of their eyes were glowing bright and Maillon started to clench his fist as his anger had fueled up after receiving such a headbutt from none other than Andreas. His eyes glowed bright purple as he clenched his teeth so tightly that his veins had started to pop with anger and his mouth full of saliva while Andreas, holding his sword in front of him, exclaimed, "Damn it," and gave a nervous, troubled look as he thought to himself how Maillon was as tough as Piet. With the help of Ketchlong, Diane had finished preparing her magic circle to use on Maillon. Abruptly, looking at Andreas, Ding yelled, addressing Andreas and telling him to get away, while Ketchlong was beside her glaring onto Andreas with a serious look on his face. Glancing back towards Diane, Andreas thought to himself, there it was, while Maillon's eyes were filled with more anger as the veins started to pop up even more, and he launched yet another attack planning to hold onto Andreas to use him as a shield against Diane's magic, but Andreas being the quick guy, he as quickly jumped mid-air dodging Maillon. While Andreas tried to get away from Maillon, who was still approaching towards him as the recent attack had fueled his anger even more. Meanwhile, Diane started to begin her magic as blue aura started to emit from the magic circle she had drawn. Her eyes glowed as it resembled a magic circle, and she raised both her hands up between her face and yelled, "Iron Impale." Abruptly, huge chunks of iron resembling the shape and sharpness of swords started to pierce through Maillon's body and his mouth as well. All of his body was pierced by the sharp iron that Diane cast. Andreas was shocked to see an attack like that, and turned back glancing towards Diane with a state of shock as he questioned himself, advanced magic. Looking at Maillon's body, which was pierced at every part of his body, Andreas thought to himself how even if it was supported, to think she would be able to repeatedly use magic that could pierce his skin that was as hard as Piet's. As Diane and Ketchlong gasped with sweat dripping from their face due to the mana they used casting the spell, Andreas, looking towards Dean, wondered how as expected from a cheat character among the playables, and at that rate, she might even create an original magic before she graduated. Looking at Maillon's body, which was covered with iron magic that Diane used to pierce through him, Andreas thought how turning the son of Beilco's director into such a mess was going to cause a lot of trouble for them. Wiping the sweat off of her face, Diane told how although he turned into a monster, this was definitely going to be a problem, to which Andreas agreed, claiming they overdid it for sure, to which Ketchlong, turning towards Dean resting his hand on himself, said it couldn't be helped and that he would help them testify as best as he could. Glancing towards Diane, Andreas thought to himself how with Diane involved, Bact would probably clean this up behind the scenes. Andreas started to make his way out of there and told Ian and Ketchlong if someone were to come, they shall explain the situation to them. Meanwhile, he would fetch the professor in charge of the class, Professor Kyler, to which Diane affirmatively agreed upon. Several explosions started to occur around the academy, as the monsters had breached everywhere, causing havoc. While the monsters screeched, students were yelling, "Monster," and told to not try and fight it but hurry up and get the professors. As Andreas was running searching for Kyler, he looked back at the explosions, thinking to himself how Kyler must have gone to his hiding place amidst all the commotion, and that he must be taken out now to prevent him from causing any more trouble. While thinking how his potion could be quite troublesome in later war scenarios, he was caught in a state of surprise as something caught his attention. It was a student from the academy who was carrying his backpack and hurriedly walking. Looking at him, Andreas thought to himself how he remembered him now. With a displeased, nervous look on his face with sweat dripping was Antonio Holt, who was Kyler's lackey. He didn't appear much, so Andreas had forgotten about him. With nervousness in his eyes, he was walking looking sideways hurriedly while Andreas peeked at him, thinking how he must be the one who had been spreading the potion everywhere, and if he were to follow him, Andreas was sure that he would lead him to Kyler. Abruptly, he was left in a state of shock as he heard someone yell, "Run, Lucia." With nervousness in his eyes, sweat started to drip from his face as he widened his gaze, turning backwards, questioning himself, "Lucia?" while Antonio had started to flee. Lucia, using a magic circle as a shield, was fighting against a monster who was maintaining its fighting stance while she saved two of the students who were behind her. While Lucia turned back, telling both of them to run away quickly, the monster in front of her, with its jaw wide open with monstrous teeth, concentrated purple mana in her mouth as her eyes glowed bright green with her sclerae pitch black. The female student was crying as she held her friend who was hurt. She yelled to Lucia, "But how about you?" Abruptly, the monster launched yet another attack towards Lucia, and it was fire, but with purple color. Using her shield, she tried to defend herself and the students using the shield, but it seemed like it was taking a toll on her. The monster was blowing purple fire from her mouth. The attack was so fierce that the purple flame slowly started to engulf Lucia and her shield, while the students yelled "Lucia," as both of them were sent flying by the overwhelming strength and flame attack of the monster. With her mouth wide open, she was continuously launching the purple flame attack from her mouth. It really started to take a toll on Lucia. With tears dropping from her eyes and sweats dripping, she exclaimed how it burned her and asked herself if she was going to die there. She increased her spell vamp and increased her shield, but the attack was so intense that it started to engulf the shield hole, and thunder started to appear as their shield and attack clashed with each other. She thought how if she knew that was going to happen, she wouldn't have bothered with the cure and should have just lived without care. But, to her surprise, Andreas came flying towards Lucia and kicked the monster with a strong kick that sent her flying as a gust of wind appeared due to the impact of the kick. Opening her eyes slowly, she looked and saw Andreas as she questioned herself, addressing Senior Seaweed. As the students started to get out of the building, one of them was screaming that he had badly injured his arm, while one quickly ran yelling that he was going to call the professors. Even Selena, Chris, and Luis made their way out of the building, but Chris looked like he was badly injured, so Selena was helping him to make his way out. While Chris was bleeding badly from his head, Luis glanced at Selena, telling her that he was going to leave Chris to her, to which Selene in a worried manner asked Chris, "What about him?" Then Luis with a determined look told her that he was going back to help Senior Vivienne, as he was getting a very bad feeling about everything that was going on. Abruptly, Ivy, who did not have an idea what was going on, so she approached the students near her, and with a cold look asked them what was all the noise about. In the meantime, Vivienne was busy dealing with Todd, as their fight had reached an intense stage with both of them fiercely attacking each other. While the fight was going on, Vivienne had a sudden realization that if she didn't stop him right there, he would definitely go after Andreas, which left her worried even more. Then Todd, with a monstrous look, was about to launch another attack at her with his sword. He instantly advanced right towards her at an incredible pace. But this time, Vivienne used her hands instead of her sword and grabbed both of Todd's hands tightly. She then looked at Todd in a cold way and swiftly moved back as if she was doing a move of some sort to take him down. Instantly, she turned the table around and countered Todd's move with a fierce move of hers, which left him badly falling to the ground. The attack from Vivienne was so powerful that it left Todd bleeding badly from his nose and mouth, but he still had a monstrous look on his face. Meanwhile, Vivienne was also injured from that encounter, as she was bleeding from her head, but she looked confused watching Todd. Out of nowhere, the clothes Todd was wearing was getting torn apart as he was evolving himself to become much bigger and stronger than he was before, while Vivienne was standing prepared in front of him. She had a worried look as she thought to herself how dangerous this was getting. She watched how Todd had transformed himself into a fierce-looking monster with sharp monster-like teeth, and his body had also transformed into something which was not human-like. Watching how he had turned into a monster made her realize she had to finish him off there, so Vivienne with a determined look approached him to launch a powerful attack. But this time, because of the increase in Todd's strength, he used both his hands like a shield to defend against the sword, which left Vivienne confused as she could not comprehend how easily her attack was defended just by the use of his hands. But suddenly, while she was thinking that, Todd launched a powerful attack which left her with no time to react. Todd only with his right hand was able to knock her to the ground and send her flying a long way back as the punch was vicious. Instantly, blood was dripping all over the floor where Vivienne was trying her best to get off the ground and stand up. She really looked badly injured as blood was coming out of her mouth as well. She had a stern look on her face as she thought to herself how weak she still was. But she didn't have any thoughts of giving up, so with all the courage and the stamina left, she slowly stood up on both her feet and was prepared to fight him more. But as the monstrous Todd was approaching with an intent to kill her, she thought that because of her being a weak fighter, she would not be able to protect Andreas. Suddenly, her expression changed as her eyes turned white with a glow in it. Gathering all the courage she had, she stood up with her swords up to defend him, but Todd was double the size compared to her as he looked ready to kill her with his right hand raised in the air to launch a vicious attack. But suddenly, Ivy, with confidence in her eyes, appeared out of the blue near Vivienne and sternly asked her if she had a death wish, which left Vivienne in a state of shock. Then Ivy, without wasting any time, protected Vivienne as she blocked his powerful attack with only her left hand and grabbed with the other hand. With a cold look on her face, she asked him if he was Todd Terry and told him that it was a shame. Without any hesitation, Ivy swung her sword with such intensity that it cut off Tolden's right hand and literally his head as well. Meanwhile, Vivienne was left in a state of shock as she witnessed all that happened, and in a worried manner called her Professor Ivy, trying to tell her not to kill Toddlon. But Ivy, putting her sword back, told her that it was already too late as there was no other option, while Vivienne, who was looking at Ivy, and thought to herself that Ivy was really a strong lady. As Ivy was looking at the scratches in her gloves, Vivienne didn't say anything and was just comprehending the whole situation. While Toddlon was on the ground without his head in his right hand, Ivy glanced back at Vivienne, telling her that she had done a good job for holding out for so long, but Vivienne was still thinking to herself that she also had to get stronger like Ivy. In the meantime, Andreas was running at an incredible pace, carrying Lucia with both his hands as the monster was following them with an intent to kill. Sensing the danger of being caught by the monster, Andreas quickly moved his hand back and used the spell Earth Shield. The spell that he used worked perfectly as the huge rock fell right on top of the monster, gaining them some time to run away. But at the same time, Andreas thought to himself that if he let Kyler slip here, the war scenario that would happen later would become more troublesome. Andreas further wondered how in the current situation, where he can't summon any undead, there was no way he could defeat that thing. Suddenly, the monster got past the Earth Shield and was quickly getting closer and closer to Andreas and Lucia. Meanwhile, Lucia had her eyes closed as she was still unconscious. Andreas thought to himself that he had to move her to a safe place first, and then the next move was to chase Kyler. Suddenly, out of nowhere, he saw Professor Beilco standing casually in front of them, leaving Andreas in a state of confusion. With an angry look on his face, Andreas called him a bastard, wondering how his students were being attacked, and he was just standing there without doing anything to protect them. Andreas then quickly passed by Beilco, telling him that he was going to leave the monster to him, but at the same time, Andreas thought to himself that the psycho professor should do his job properly. While the monster was approaching Professor Beilco at an incredible pace, Beilco was not bothered by the monster, as he glanced back at Andreas and wondered how he was hoping he would show him something interesting. As the monster was getting closer to him, he still didn't give the monster any importance as he was still looking back at Andreas, giving him a stern look. Beilco had his hand on his pockets as he used a spell of some sort which was so powerful that it had enveloped all over the monster, and the explosion was so intense that it instantly destroyed the monster into oblivion. In the meantime, Andreas had reached the infirmary, while Lucia was laying on the bed being carefully looked after by the doctor. The doctor then told Andreas that Lucia was fine and that she just went into shock because her mana was depleted, further telling him that she will be completely fine after taking some rest. Suddenly, Lucia started to open her eyes slowly as she started getting her consciousness back. The doctor noticed her opening her eyes as the doctor said that it looked like she was up already. Then Andreas, being worried about her, quickly asked her if she was doing good, while the doctor looked at them and told him that she was taking her leave. Meanwhile, Lucia still looked weak as she looked at Andreas and told him how she thought she was going to die, to which Andreas replied that she was close to dying, further asking her why she even thought about fighting it. Then Lucia replied back, telling him how she didn't want to fight either, but she had no choice as there were people who were tapped and couldn't escape from the monster. Listening to this brought a smile on his face as he told her how she sounded like a hero, but at the same time Andreas thought to himself how if things had gone the way they were supposed to, she wouldn't have been involved at all, blaming himself for it. Then Lucia, with an angry and annoyed look, told Andreas how his cute junior almost died, to which Andreas in a joking manner replied how it looked like she was doing fine if she could quit back like the way she did, but at the same time he wondered how it must have been terrifying for her, and maybe terrifying enough to make her want to lock herself in her room and become a research hermit. Suddenly, he turned back and told her that he was busy, so he would be making his way out, to which Lucia in an annoyed manner asked him if he only came there to make fun of her. Andreas then gave a quick glance back at Lucia, telling her that once all these things were over, they should start working on her potion making. Immediately, her expression changed as she had a look of shock while thinking about something. Suddenly, she started to remember everything that had happened before she got to the infirmary. She remembered how it was Andreas who was the one who fought the monster. She then got the memories of her losing her consciousness and also remembered how she called Andreas Senior Seaweed at that same time. She also remembered how she was about to fall down to the ground. But it was Andreas himself who quickly grabbed Lucia and brought her safely to the infirmary. Thinking about all of this, Lucia blushed with a smile on her face and also acknowledged Andreas for being so protective of her. After some time had passed, Andreas made his way to the mysterious house in the middle of forest as he thought to himself how if things went according to the scenario, Kyler's boss fight should take place at this hideout. But Andreas was not fully sure if Kyler was here as the event occurred at a different time, further wondering how in the game, Andreas needed his companion's NPCs to beat him. Without wasting any time, he brought out both his legendary summons, Nickel and Timer. Both of them looked as vicious as ever, looking prepared for another fight. Andreas then raised his hands, ordering both of the legendary summons to go and destroy the house. Hearing this made both of them start running towards the house at an incredible pace. While Andreas was watching from the back, both Timer and Nickel launched an attack with such intensity that it completely destroyed the house. Then Andreas had a dissatisfied look on his face as he told them that they did not have to mess things up that far. Suddenly, Timer had grabbed someone from inside the house as Timer was viciously grabbing his neck, making the man cry as he was in terrible pain. Andreas, who was witnessing this, had a look of bewilderment as he recognized the person was Antonio Holt himself, which made him realize that Kyler must be there too. Timer was still grabbing him tightly by his neck while without any hesitation, Nickel viciously cut Antonio into half. As both of them were standing tall in front of Antonio, Andreas slowly made his way to them, but at the same time was wondering how Timer was quite a beast after his successful evolution, and even the monster in its final phase was easily defeated by him. As he looked at the legendary Tiger King, a system notification popped up stating how Timer was a legendary tier Revenant Berserker who was of tier 6 with mana of 2010. His trait was Ego, and he had mastery of Melee and Berserk. He then glanced at Nickel, thinking to himself Nickel was buffed by the deadly sins, so a mid-level boss shouldn't be a problem to him. Andreas suddenly got on his knees as he sensed something on the ground. He carefully looked on the floor and asked himself if the entrance to the hideout was somewhere around here, while Nickel was carefully looking from the back. Andreas then placed his hand on the floor and used some sort of spell on it, which started to show a circle with forbidden inscriptions on it. Out of nowhere, there was an opening on the floor of the house as a passage opened up right where Andreas used his spell on. Then, with a determined look on his face, he told his summons that they should now go and pay the terrorist a visit. Andreas, accompanied by his undead companions Nickel and Timer, slowly steps through the door of the hideout. Suddenly, he feels a strong sense of danger coming from inside the hideout, making him tense and alert. Out of nowhere, a black surge suddenly shot out, aiming straight at Andreas and his companions, Timer and Nickel. The unexpected attack caught them off guard, forcing them to quickly step back to avoid getting hit. It turned out to be Kyler, completely surrounded by a dark aura. He looked straight at Andreas and demanded to know how he had found his way to that place. Andreas, with Timer and Nickel, quickly stepped back from where they were standing. At the same time, Kyler appeared from the hideout's door, completely surrounded by a dark, ominous aura. After stepping out of the hideout, Kyler addressed Andreas, calling him Karen's apprentice, Andreas Cromwell. Out of nowhere, a massive undead hand appeared from above Kyler. He felt its presence immediately, his face showing a mix of surprise and tension as he realized what was happening. The massive undead hand swung its fist towards Kyler, launching a powerful attack. But Kyler reacted quickly, dodging the strike just in time and leaping into the air to avoid the blow. Kyler was completely confused, thinking to himself, what in the world was that? But before he could finish his sentence, his arm was suddenly sliced in half. He looked down in shock, his face filled with tension and fear, only to see that his arm was dangling in midair. It had been Nickel who had cut his arm with such speed that Kyler hadn't even noticed it happen. Kyler looked down in shock, realizing his arm was gone. The pain hit him instantly, and he screamed, trembling from the shock. With an aggressive look on his face, Andreas spoke up, saying, "Whoops, my bad, that was supposed to be your neck." Kyler, still writhing in pain, yelled at Andreas, "You little brat. Now I understand. You're the one who killed Sharon." Without hesitation, Timer charges forward and strikes at Kyler with both fists simultaneously. Kyler, caught off guard and confused, glances back at Timer's massive figure looming over him. Timer's powerful strike landed directly on Kyler, hitting him with immense force. The impact sent Kyler crashing to the ground with such intensity that the earth beneath him shattered. Nearby, Andreas stood watching the devastating blow unfold and command Timer to finish him in one blow. Then Timer, the undead, roared fiercely as he charged down toward his opponent, Kyler, who lay helpless on the ground. Timer was filled with a deadly eagerness to end Kyler's life. Timer unleashed a powerful punch on Kyler, sending up a massive cloud of smoke. The impact was so intense that it completely destroyed the ground beneath them, leaving it shattered. Meanwhile, Andreas, with a confused look on his face, tried to understand what had happened after Timer's punch struck. He carefully observed the scene, struggling to piece together the events that unfolded. As the smoke cleared, Kyler was revealed lying on the ground, completely surrounded by a black aura that acted as a shield. Timer's hand was caught in the shield, unable to break through. He let out a low, growling roar as he struggled against the barrier. Without warning, Timer was struck by a black shadow, forcing him to stumble backward away from Kyler. Timer was completely trapped by Kyler's black shadow, unable to move. At the same time, Kyler was fully encased in a suit of dark shadow armor, making him look even more menacing. With a fierce and angry tone, Kyler said to Andreas, "No matter how selfish we black mages can be, I can't believe you would kill Sharon, the one who raised you." Andreas, maintaining a calm expression as he observed Kyler, remarked, "So, that's the final stage of the shadow armor and even has the ability to replace lost body parts." Andreas drew his sword and said, "A shadow armor, huh?" as he stared at Kyler, who was standing right in front of him. Kyler, looking surprised, questioned him, "How do you know about this?" "That's impossible. No one should know about it except Master Jest." Without hesitating, Andreas drew his sword and unleashed a massive wave of fire, sending it straight toward Kyler. Kyler quickly jumped to the side, dodging the attack, but the force of it also caused Timer to break free from the shadow that had been holding him. Timer, just freed from the shadow, slid across the ground and stood up, surrounded by a cloud of dust. Andreas, with a confident expression, said, "Oh, I know it well. It's a rare high-end item with both offensive and defensive powers." In response, Kyler, matching his confidence with a laugh, replied, "Then you must also understand that you have no chance of winning." Suddenly, Andreas enveloped his sword in a magical flame aura and said, "It's weak against fire, isn't it?" Kyler, looking slightly scared and confused, stared at him. Kyler unexpectedly launched an attack at Andreas using his black armor, forcing Andreas to release his magic and block the strike with his sword. Kyler kept launching relentless attacks at Andreas, shouting, "So what if it's weak to fire? All I have to do is make sure you don't get the time to chant." Andreas skillfully dodged each attack, staying focused and avoiding Kyler's strikes. Out of nowhere, a powerful punch hits Kyler. Reacting quickly, he raised his hand and managed to block the strike just in time. The punch came from Timer, the undead, and its sheer force sent Kyler flying far from Andreas. The impact was so powerful that Kyler was thrown across the area, landing hard in the distance. Then Andreas, maintaining a calm expression, commanded Timer, "All right, go with Nickel and keep him occupied for a while." In response, Timer let out a low, aggressive growl as his way of agreeing with Andreas' command. Without wasting any time, Kyler got back on his feet from where he had been thrown and sneered at Andreas, saying, "Do you really think mere undead like them can buy you time? What a joke." He then began casting a spell. Kyler, with his eyes glowing with energy, then without any hesitation rushed towards Nickel and Timer to kill them in one shot. Meanwhile, Nickel along with Timer also had a determined look on their faces as they rushed towards Kyler to stop him on his tracks and destroy him. Simultaneously, while Andreas was preparing the next plan of action, a huge explosion happened where Timer and Nickel were fighting Kyler. Andreas then channeled his mana into his sword and exclaimed "Phew," as it took more time than he initially thought while his sword began to transform into something else entirely. At the same time, Timer was struggling as the black wipes had caught his hands and legs, making Timer immobilized. But Timer was not alone as Nickel, sensing the danger, rushed at Kyler, ready to launch his attack on him with full force. Suddenly, to Nickel's surprise, Kyler launched more black whips-like things towards Nickel too, making Nickel unable to attack or defend. Then Kyler began mocking Andreas, stating that even if a bunch of them brain-dead monkeys come at him, but suddenly stopped talking as he sensed something was off. Then as Kyler glanced at Timer, Timer kept relentlessly biting the black whip, making Kyler even more confused and puzzled. Kyler then glanced towards Nickel, who was also relentlessly trying to cut the black whip-like things, which made Kyler even more confused as he thought how that one also. Kyler then, with a look of shock, questioned himself if mere undead were breaking through the shadow binding, but dismissed the thought, saying no way, as that would be absurd. But as Timer and Nickel struggled a little more, they were actually able to break free from Kyler's shadow binding and began rushing at him, which made him question what in the world were they. Then Kyler, sensing the danger, immediately tried to defend with both his hands as he wondered if it could be. Immediately, Timer and Nickel attacked Kyler, causing a huge explosion, which sent him flying in the opposite direction as he wondered if they were the corpse Andreas got from the congregation. As Kyler was sent flying, he also glanced at Andreas, which confused him even more as to what he was doing. Meanwhile, Andreas' hand completed transform his sword with his magic, calling it Fusion Magic Bone Whip, which made his sword turn into a whip-like sword. Kyler then tried to brace for impact as he landed on the ground, trying not to fall back, and began to question himself if that was a whip. But Kyler had not time to keep wondering as Nickel began to rush towards Kyler to deliver another deadly strike with his sword. Instantly, as Nickel's sword almost reached Kyler, he launched another shadow towards Nickel, trying to defend against his attack. At the same time, Andreas also rushed towards Kyler and launched his newly transformed Fusion Magic Bone Whip sword. Even though Andreas was far away from Kyler, with just a single swing from his sword, he was unable to reach Kyler as he sword dashed towards Kyler, moving like a whip, while all Kyler could do was look at turn towards Andreas in surprise. But as Kyler tried to comprehend what weapon Andreas just used, the sword had already surrounded him, making him even more shocked. Immediately, the sword was wrapped around Kyler, making him immobilized, as he gave a puzzled look trying to understand Andreas's intention. Kyler then, glancing towards Andreas, told him that he said he was going with a fire attack and began mocking him, saying, but there he was with a physical attack. Kyler then began mocking Andreas even more, saying, don't tell me he was here just talking big and he couldn't even use one. While Timer, who was beside Nickel, dashed towards Andreas. Andreas then, with a determined look, exclaimed ha as his nose started to bleed from the overuse of mana, but Kyler began laughing and pointed out that puny trick of his could cost him his life. Even though Andreas was bleeding, it was not enough to stop Andreas for attacking Kyler. So he immediately casted the spell Bone Explosion. Simultaneously, the whip sword that was wrapping Kyler started to burn as Kyler tried to process how that was possible, but immediately realized that it was double chanting. Instantly, a huge explosion occurred where Kyler was, which caused immense destruction, burning everything and sent shockwaves all around, while Andreas and Timer tried to brace from shockwaves. Andreas then, wiping the blood from his nose, thought how it was more taxing on the body than he thought. Furthermore, he wondered how Diane was really something else to be able to pull it off so easily. Then, as the fire began to vanish, Andreas opened the portals to send Nickel and Timer back, and thought how he would say that new technique was a great success apart from turning the corpse to dust because he used too much mana. Then, as Nickel and Timer left, Andreas thought how with someone as high profile as Kyler dead, the congregation was bound to make a move. Then he decided that for now he would grab the items from the safe house, erase his tracks, and leave, as besides the academy was probably in an uproar, so he should hurry back. At the same time, somewhere in the academy, someone slammed their fist into the desk with anger. It was none other than the Tower Master Bard Alvin, who with a serious expression asked his subordinate to say that again and asked him how many people. In response, his subordinates with a worried look told him, yes, there are 15 people, including the 4 students from Beilco. He then proceeded to say that according to the witnesses, the student who distributed the potion was a student called Antonio Holt, who was currently missing. Furthermore, he was an assistant to Professor Kyler, so most likely. He was suddenly stopped by the Tower Master, who claimed that it was enough as he sat down on his chair. Bart then told his subordinate to suspend the academy's activities until the investigation into that incident was closed, and that further details would be announced after discussions with Principal Zeos, to which his subordinate immediately responded affirmatively. Instantly after his subordinate left the room, Bart Alvin, the Tower Master, just sat there in complete silence, trying to comprehend how all that was possible. Then, with a look of determination, Brat Alvin began to wonder what was happening in Rodland.